Hello, and welcome to another edition of Energize Your Next Presentation. My name is Glenn Anderson. I am a professional speaker. I focus on topics like team building and collaboration, communication skills, presentation skills, team leadership. And today, in this edition of Energize Your Next Presentation, we're going to focus on a topic that might be a little off the normal things that you think about when we talk about presenting. We're going to talk about spontaneous speaking, how to be a successful spontaneous speaker. Now, spontaneous speaking, this is what happens when, for example, you're sitting in a team meeting and suddenly the boss looks at you or the team leader looks at you and says, Glenn, why don't you take the next few minutes and give us an update on how that task force is going that you're leading, or that project that you're working on? It's when you're suddenly called upon to give a little speech or a little miniature presentation, and you haven't had any opportunity to plan it out in advance. A question and answer session would be spontaneous speaking. So maybe you've given a presentation, and then at the end, you've opened it up for questions. And as you respond to those questions, that's spontaneous speaking. Obviously, the difference here is that you have not had a chance to rehearse. You've not had a chance to create an outline of what you're going to cover or create some charts that are going to support what you're talking about. So, how can you become a successful, spontaneous speaker? I want to give you some ideas to think about in our edition here today of Energize Your Next Presentation. And it all starts with this: get out of your own way. In other words, lighten up a little when it comes to the fact that you know at some point you're going to have to be doing spontaneous speaking. Lighten up. Don't worry about it. And especially don't try to plan out in advance what you might do if you're called upon to make a spontaneous speech. So, how can you get out of your own way? Well, first of all, dare to be dull. And that might sound kind of funny, but what I'm saying here is this is not going to be perfection. All right. You know, this is not going to be perfect. You've not had a chance to prepare an outline and rehearse in advance. So dare to be dull. You want to answer the question, you want to put the information out there, but it's not going to be perfect. One way to think about this would be that it's more of a conversation. So when you're giving a formal presentation or you're giving a formal speech, there's a feeling there. But here with spontaneous speaking, it might be more of in a conversational kind of setting as you talk back and forth with the person that has asked you to do this spontaneous speaking. So dare to be a little dull. Folks, less is more. This is always true when you're giving any kind of a presentation. In one of the early episodes of our series that we're doing here, I was talking about the problem of too much content. And you can go back and listen if you missed that episode earlier. But one of the things I suggested there is that there's a myth in the world of presenting and speaking. The myth is that presenters think that in order for their audience to understand anything, they have to tell them everything. And that is a myth, folks, and that is not true. It's not true when you're preparing a presentation, and it is certainly not true when you're responding spontaneously to something that someone has asked you. Less is more. When you try to do a data dump, when you try to tell someone everything you know about a subject as fast as you can in the small amount of time that you might have to respond spontaneously, people are not going to remember it all. They're going to get lost in all the details. And so, thinking in terms of what is truly important, what do I really need to say to answer this query to speak spontaneously? That's what you need to focus on. Less is more. Avoid stockpiling. Stockpiling is when you have planned out your answers in advance. So, for example, you might be getting ready to go into a team meeting and you suspect that the leader of the meeting at some point might call on you to talk about your project or the task force that you are leading. And so, in advance of the meeting, you start thinking, well, if they ask me this, I need to answer this way. And if they ask me this, I need to make sure to cover this and this and this. And so you're filling your head in advance with all the things you think you might need to say if you are called upon to give spontaneous speaking. And that is called stockpiling. And folks, let me tell you, it doesn't work. Now, let me tell you a story about this. Some of you know that I have spent most of my adult life studying and performing improvisational comedy. And I was part of an improv comedy team for many, many years. Now, if you've ever watched improv comedy before, you know how it works. The actors come on stage, they ask for a suggestion from the audience, and then they create a scene based on that suggestion. So there is no pre planning, no script, no rehearsal. It's just happening on the fly. Well, when I was a relatively new improv actor and I was just getting started in this, I would know that a show was coming up. Maybe this was Friday, and we knew that on Friday night we're going to be doing a show with the troupe. And so as I was going through the day on Friday, I would start stockpiling ideas that I thought might be good for scenes to use in the show that night. So I'd see something on the news, perhaps, or I'd read the newspaper. I go, oh, that's an interesting thing. I should have that in my head. And so I'd stick that in my head and think that might work for a scene. Or maybe something funny would happen, or I'd be out and about and I'd see something funny on the street, or I'd have a funny encounter with someone in a store. And I go, yeah, that's funny. I should stick that in my head. And so I would be filling my head all day long with all these ideas that I thought might be good to use that night in the improv show. So the show would happen, and I would come on stage and I'd be part of an improv scene. And all I'd be thinking about is all this stuff I had stuck in my head. How can I use this? How can I use this? How can I get this idea into the scene? Rather than just going with the flow of what was happening in the improv scene. I was trying to stockpile in advance ideas to use. And that way I lost the focus of what was really happening as the improvisational scene was unfolding in the show on stage that night. That was a hard lesson for me to learn as a new improv actor, to avoid stockpiling. And so you want to avoid this. You don't want to try to plan out in advance what the answer is that you might be bringing when someone calls on you to speak spontaneously. Avoid stockpiling. Folks, substitute attention for preparation. And again, this is kind of feeds off of the stockpiling idea. So if you're sitting in a team meeting and all you're doing is thinking about, what am I going to do when the boss calls on me? What am I going to say when I am called on to suddenly give a little spontaneous presentation about my project? And so you're trying to prepare in your head, and you're running through this file of stockpiling that you've stuck in your head, and you're not paying attention to what is going on in the meeting. And so you might be missing some pretty interesting stuff. The people who are speaking before you might be offering some ideas or some updates on what they are working on that would apply to you. But you're missing this because you're sitting there trying to prepare in advance what you're going to do when the boss calls on you. So you want to substitute that attention, paying attention, for this fake preparation that you're doing in your head. There's a wonderful little book that I would highly recommend if you'd like to do a little more reading on this subject, called Improv Wisdom. And the subtitle, you see it there, don't prepare, just show up. And this book is written by a lady, Patricia Ryan Madsen, who has been a teacher of improv at the university level for many, many years. And she's just sharing in this book some wisdom that comes from thinking like improv actors. And she says this idea of don't prepare, what that really means is letting go of your ego involvement in the process. Your ego is involved here. You're so afraid that when you're called on to speak spontaneously, that you're going to kind of fumble and mumble and maybe not do the best job. And so you're stockpiling and you're worried and you're trying to prepare in advance. And that is your ego saying, I want to make sure that I'm perfect, even though it's not possible to be perfect when you're spontaneously speaking. So don't prepare really means letting go of that ego involvement. Folks, there is a freedom that comes when you can trust that you have what you need, and you need to discover the feeling of that freedom as you sit there waiting for your opportunities to spontaneously speak. You are smart, you are experienced, you know what you're doing, you know what you're talking about. And when you get called on to speak spontaneously, there's a freedom that comes when you can just sit back and trust and go, yes, I'm experienced, I know what I'm doing, I'm going to share. That is what I need, and I trust that I have that. There's a great freedom that comes with that. So those are some thoughts about this first point here. Get out of your own way. Dare to be dull. And substitute attention for preparation. And above all, don't get caught in the trap of trying to stockpile. Those are some ways to get out of your own way. Lighten up and don't pre-plan. Another way to be a successful spontaneous speaker is to see it as an opportunity. You know, sometimes what might happen is you actually given a prepared presentation, and then you open it up for questions and answers. And many times you might be thinking of that Q&A session in kind of an adversarial way. You're like, oh, I've just presented the plan that I have come up with, and now they're going to shoot it down. They're going to ask questions to try to show me how wrong I am about the approach that I am presenting here. And so you're viewing this spontaneous speaking that's going to come in a Q&A session as adversarial. And I would suggest that you will approach it in a much better way if you see it as an opportunity. It might be an opportunity to re-explain in a different way because people didn't truly understand what you were saying the first time. It might be an opportunity to assuage their fears. If people are afraid of what you presented, you can kind of get in there and say, okay, it's really not that way. It's an opportunity for you to eliminate their fear. Or it's an opportunity to eliminate their confusion. They're confused about what you said. So I think especially in a Q&A kind of session, which is spontaneous speaking for sure, you can view that as an opportunity to re-explain, eliminate confusion, clear things up. It's an opportunity. If you have that mindset, that's going to affect how you approach that spontaneous speaking opportunity. Another thing you need to do is slow down and listen. Often when the boss starts to, say, Glenn, hey, can you take a few minutes and give us an update? And boom, you're just ready to just jump right in there and start talking. And maybe you're not really listening to everything that the boss is asking you to talk about. There's a difference between listening to respond versus listening to truly understand. And in business in particular, maybe in life, I would say, many people, what they do is they listen to merely respond. What that means is you're just waiting for the other person to stop talking so you can start talking. And you're really not hearing what they're saying. You're not listening to truly understand all the way to the end of what they're saying before then you start to formulate in your mind what you should say back. So you can become a much better spontaneous speaker if, when someone starts to ask that question, or someone starts to ask you to give a little report, that you slow down and make sure you hear everything that they are saying to you. And then take a pause, take a breath, and start to respond spontaneously. Number 4 is paraphrase. Using paraphrase can really help you in a spontaneous speaking situation. Communication professionals often call paraphrase the Swiss Army knife of communication because there are so many different things that you can do by simply paraphrasing what someone has asked you. So, for example, they ask you a rather complicated question, and as you repeat the question back to them, as you paraphrase the question back to them, you're allowing your brain time to think about the answer that you're going to provide. So you're kind of using paraphrase as a stall tactic, kind of a hidden stall tactic, because you're repeating the question, but merely what you're doing is allowing your brain time to think, what is the answer that I want to construct? That's one use of paraphrase. Another use is if you are repeating the question back, you're simply confirming that you heard the question the way that the person asked it, so that you heard and understand the question that they are asking you. So that can happen when you paraphrase. Another trick might be that you use paraphrase to tweak the question a little. Maybe you don't want to exactly answer that question, but you want to change up the question just a little bit to what you want to answer. And you do that through paraphrase. You take the question they have asked and you change it a little as you repeat it back. Politicians, of course, they're the experts at this. They take the question that the media asks and they twist it to be the question that they truly want to answer. But in any case, there are all these different things that you can do with paraphrase, the Swiss Army knife of communication. Very valuable as you're listening to someone and you are getting ready to give a spontaneous answer back to them. And number 5, tell a story or respond to this spontaneous speaking request with a story that follows a structure. Again, we're trying to focus on less is more. The answer here is that we want people to understand the answer that we are providing. And so we don't want them to get lost in a lot of data or a lot of confusing facts. We want to make sure they are following what we're saying as we respond spontaneously. And one way to do that is to couch your answer in a predefined structure. Now, I just spent the last few minutes telling you don't pre-plan, don't stockpile, don't plan in advance what you're going to say. And I'm not going back on that. But what I'm suggesting here is that there is a structure that you have in mind as you give your spontaneous answer. It'll help the audience not get lost and follow as you move through your answer. One example would be here. You state your problem, the problem that you're working on or the opportunity that you've been given. Then you state the solution that you have come up with and you describe that, and then you finish with the benefit that your solution provides to solving the problem or building on the opportunity. So simply taking the question that they've asked, or when the boss says, Glenn, give us a little update on what you're working on. Here's the problem, here's the solution, here's the benefit. It's a structure you can use as you spontaneously speak to keep your audience from losing their way. Or here's another one. If you don't like the first one, this one is a little different. It asks 3 questions. What? So what? Now what? So they've just asked you to give a little report on what you're doing. So what? What am I working on? What is the initiative, as the chart here says? So what? Why is this important? What is its significance? So what? And then now what? What are we going to be doing? What are the next steps that we're going to be taking? So either one of these, so whether you use problem, solution, benefit, or you use what, So what? Now what? These are a couple structures that you can use to make it easier for your audience to follow as you are spontaneously answering the question or the request that they have given you. So these are 5 ideas here around becoming a more successful, spontaneous speaker. When you're called upon to give that little speech or give that little presentation spontaneously. So get out of your own way, lighten up, don't pre-plan. See it as an opportunity, not an adversarial situation, but an opportunity to explain, to eliminate confusion, to clarify. Make sure you slow down and hear everything that is in the request, everything that is in the question. Listen to understand. Don't just listen to respond. Use paraphrase, the Swiss Army knife of communication. As you paraphrase the request back, there's lots of things that you can be using that for. And then think about one of those structures and couch your answer in that structure that I gave you. If you take these 5 ideas, I think you can become a much more confident and effective spontaneous speaker. So the next time the boss turns to you and says, Glenn, give us a couple-minute update here on how that project is going. You can do a great job answering that request spontaneously. These are some reference materials in general on how to be a better public speaker. Again, it's not in this list, but I would suggest that little book I referenced a couple pages back, Improv Wisdom, if you want to especially explore this idea of thinking like an improv actor, not preparing in advance, just showing up, trusting that you have what you need. But back into the more traditional world of presenting, these are some books I've mentioned before that are very helpful, and some websites where you can find useful resources and advice to becoming a better public speaker. So I've summarized every one of the episodes here in this series with this 3 points: inspiration, information, and insight. And what I've told you in the past is if your presentation addresses these 3 things, you provide some inspiration to your audience, you give them the information they need, and you give them your personal insight on that information, that there will be value that you will give to your audience. Now, these also relate to spontaneous speaking. I would say maybe in a spontaneous speaking situation, you might not have the opportunity to inspire as much as you would in a rehearsed, pre-prepared presentation. But your effective spontaneous speaking should definitely deliver information, and it should be delivering insight to your audience on that information. So you still want to be focused on these when you spontaneously speak. And this favorite quote, I've used this before: they may forget what you said, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And I would say this equally applies to spontaneous speaking, because if you approach that with the confidence that hopefully I've helped you discover through my 5 points, if you discover the freedom that comes from trusting that you have what you need to answer your spontaneous speaking situation with confidence and intelligence, you're going to make your audience feel good. And again, they'll never forget how you made them feel. So those are my thoughts on spontaneous speaking. I would love to hear from you. My email and my website are down in the lower right-hand corner of this chart. Again, my name is Glenn Anderson, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of Energize Your Next Presentation.